And thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the Bay Area Book Festival panel on climate fiction as a tool for climate justice. We have an amazing panel. So let's just start out with a round of applause for this incredible panel we have today to talk about this. My name is Keya Chatterjee. I am a longtime climate change activist. I'm based in Washington, D.C. on unceded Piscataway land. I use she, her pronouns. And my background was originally as a climate scientist working at NASA. I came in as a climate activist. I'm board chair of Sunrise Movement, which is a youth climate organization. And I've done I've done everything from like chain myself to pipelines to lead trainings. And I'm just so grateful to everybody here for helping a much, much bigger community of people really be able to think about this issue in a new and different way and come into it through the most basic human thing that we do of telling stories. So, in trainings I say all the time, human beings, we evolved sitting around a fire telling stories. And those are the stories that teach us things, even before there was writing, it's through chants. It's through stories that we really were able to convey messages to people. And as a climate activist, I'm somewhat biased, but I can think of no more important message to convey to people than that we can choose a different way. We don't have to be in this like dig, extract, burn, buy low, sell high culture that we have established for ourselves. We can be in a different way. And these are the amazing voices that help us to imagine that different way. There's an author called Amitav Ghosh who wrote a book about writing about climate change in fiction. It's a nonfiction book about climate fiction. And one of the things that he says in his book is it's really about imagining a different future. And so I'm just going to read a quote from that book. He says, "To think about the world only as it is amounts to a formula for collective suicide. We need rather to envision what it might be." So rather than reading all your bios, since none of you came here to hear me talk, I'm going to pass it to these amazing authors. And what I'm going to ask you to do, give you 3 to 5 minutes, and I really want you to not be shy in this 3 to 5 minutes. I want you to brag about yourselves. Like really brag about yourselves, because everyone here needs to hear like the thing you did that's like you're super proud of and is really impressive. So I want you to brag about yourselves. And then I want you to answer the question of what are you trying to help people envision or imagine? So like you can think of it any way you want. You can think of it starting a sentence with imagine a world where, or what do you want people to be able to imagine so that we can get to this other world that we're all seeking? So why don't we just go straight down the line if that's okay. You guys have microphones. Excuse me, y'all have microphones. Yeah.
Absolutely. Hello, my name is Aya de León. Hey. I have on many hats. I've been the interim program director here at the book festival, and this was a conversation I was thrilled to have with these other climate novelists as a novelist. So I've written 5 climate novels. The first one, I was working on a feminist heist series, sort of sexy sex worker heist series out of New York. Then Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, and I wanted to write about it. So Side Chick Nation was the first novel published about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and it's also a heist, a romance, a sexy book, urban fiction. Like, it was all the things. And that was the first of several books that I wrote. And my climate fiction approach is I write contemporary realistic fiction of, poor and working class women of African heritage who are going about their business not thinking about the climate crisis, and they get impacted and politicized and decide to take action and to participate in movements. And I'm currently obsessed with trying to write the story where we win. In the context of the kinds of conditions that we actually are in, what would it look like to win? And, that's really, that's for me, what I want people to imagine is that we could. You know, that's sort of my obsession and why I'm thrilled to be here with these other authors, because I see all of us really trying to bring everyone's attention to climate. And I love all of the sci-fi fantasy writing about climate, but I'm also obsessed with trying to get more people who write contemporary realistic to write about climate and winning, because I feel like dystopia has been giving us really important cautionary tales. You know, Parable of the Sower was 30 years old last year. So, like, we've been getting important cautionary tales for a long time. It's time for the contemporary realistic folks to pick up the mantle and start writing about climate in the here and now with an idea of how we can get where we want to go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Roanhorse, and I write speculative fiction. For my climate work, my first book, Trail of Lightning, was set in the near future on the Navajo Nation. And at the time I was living on the Navajo Nation, I was a lawyer before I was a writer, but I was not a very good lawyer. So I was happy to leave that behind. But my specialty was in federal Indian law and tribal law. So I worked on the reservation and then in the first state and everything. But anyway, in Trail of Lightning, one of the things I really wanted to do in this near future world was center Indigenous people, so that all the things that were considered negatives about living on the res, like when I lived there, I lived with my in-laws in a trailer. We worked on a generator. We had to haul in water. All these things that seem like negatives to the larger, richer world actually become positives. Because when the world goes to hell because of climate change, who's going to survive? These people who have been surviving on this land for generations. And so that was really one of my goals in that book. And then I write a lot of fantasy. This is high fantasy. Mirrored Heavens, my next book that's coming out Tuesday, so you guys get it early, a few days early. It is the last book in a trilogy that is pre-Columbian. It's inspired by the pre-Columbian Mesoamerican world. Think the Maya, the Mexica, the ancestral Puebloans, folks like that. It also centers queer identities and disabled characters and lets them live big, full lives with adventure and love and all of those things that have very little to do with their quote-unquote identities. It's because they're humans, right? And they're living these wonderful human lives. Well, they're also avatars of gods, but that's a little to the side. And so, I think that's sort of my bio. I think that's pretty good. Thank you. Woo!
I'm Sim Kern. My pronouns are they, them. I write, so my last 4 books have all been science fiction, near future and more far future sci-fi, dealing with both climate dystopias and utopias. So I have some solar punk writing as well. This one's kind of like an imperfect solar punk. It's like a false utopian future. And I recently wrote a historical fiction about queer Jews in the 17th century, dealing with like the roots of the climate crisis in the beginning of, during the era of colonization. So that's sort of my fiction side. I've also been an investigative journalist into petrochemical companies in Houston. So I'm based in Houston. So living in sort of the heart of the petrochemical industry, in the really unique coastal climate of Houston, which is actually so important to the entire Gulf of Mexico estuary, or it's the estuary for the entire Gulf of Mexico. We get battered by hurricanes every other summer. So like all of those influences have kind of come into my work. And then as an activist, I've actually been really focusing the past few years on like finding my home in the climate movement. Has been in the movement for a free Palestine. As a Jewish author, I've done I do a lot of writing on social media about deconstructing Zionism, because Palestine is connected to abolition, and without abolition, we don't get any social justice. We don't get any movement on climate. So that's kind of where I live in the climate sphere.
Yeah, I'm so honored to be on a panel with such incredible authors. Up here with some of my heroes. I'm so excited. I'm Charlie Jane Anders. My latest book is Promises Stronger Than Darkness. It's the third book of a young adult sort of space fantasy trilogy, sort of think Star Wars, Star Trek, about like a teenage girl who's secretly an alien who, is excited to kind of reclaim her alien heritage and go back into space and become like the second coming of the alien hero she was in a past life. But then, a lot of these books end up being about violence and about like whether violence is the best way to solve our problems and how we can maybe find other ways, or how we can at least think about what we're doing instead of just going pew, pew, pew and killing everybody who gets in our way. That kind of snuck up on me, but that ends up being like the real heart of this trilogy, is grappling with our willingness to just fall back on violence as like the easy solution every frickin' time, anytime we have a problem, anytime there's someone standing in our way. And like, how do we deal with genocide and fascism, and how do we come together, and how do we build alliances and communities? That kind of ends up being the heart of this trilogy. I've written a lot of sort of climate fiction. My short story collection, Even Greater Mistakes, has a bunch of stories about people who are grappling with the effects of climate change. I'm really interested in telling stories about communities coming together and people, like I said, building alliances, and especially queer and trans people, kind of finding their own community, especially after the last few years of like queer and trans people really needing to be there for each other and nobody else seeming to be there for us a lot of the time, unfortunately. And I think that this does tie in with other movements against oppression and supremacy. I think it's all connected 100%. And I also, sorry, I'm gonna go on too much, but I also helped to create a trans superhero for Marvel recently named Escapade, with the help of a couple of really incredible non-binary artists. And I'm reviewing sci-fi fantasy books for the Washington Post. I have a book coming out next year called The Prodigal Mother, about a young witch who decides to teach her lesbian mom how to do magic. And it's about queer generational trauma and kind of about climate as well. I got stickers. Come find me. I'll give you a sticker. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to give you guys a B for the bragging, because I happen to have looked at all of your bios, and you have won a lot of awards and done a lot of things you did not actually talk about, but great job. Just so everybody knows, right after the session, some of the authors are going to be right there signing books, but also all of their books are available. At least one or more of all of their books are available over there. So please do go buy books afterwards. I want to come back to a theme that came up in a lot of what you were saying about the intersectionality of social justice issues more broadly, and all of your work really is incredibly powerful in the context of inclusion. It's something that really jumps out at me in all of your work. Can you, anyone who wants to, just talk a little bit about why, for you, in the context of advancing climate justice, this work of inclusion is so central in your writing, and was it if there's a story of which you came to first, I'd be interested in just like how that happened.
Okay, I'll say something. So for me, I'm a big science fiction and fantasy fan. That's really where my passion lies. And that's always like what I grew up reading and what was sort of what inspired my imagination. But there weren't a lot or really any native people in science fiction and fantasy. And if there were, they were the sidekicks. Or they were very stereotypical, or maybe they were like half native and then they turned into an animal and that was their special power. And I just found that really depressing. And so I actually came to writing late. Like I said, I was a lawyer before this, and then I was something else before that even. And so I came to writing because I wanted to write the stories that I wanted to read. And so I was really inspired to write a science fiction or fantasy, or science fantasy story where natives were really the entire cast. Black and Native folks were the entire cast. And they got to be the villains, and they got to be the heroes, they got to be the love interests, they got to be everything in between. And so for me, it was imagining the world that I saw around me every day in the future as well. Because I think a lot of people think of natives as in the past. You know, there's plenty of shows where in the 1800s, you know, the natives are fighting the cowboys or whoever they're fighting, and usually getting slaughtered. And so for me, it felt very radical to put natives in the future and have them be thriving. And nobody's tragic, there's no sort of tragedy porn, for lack of a better word, going on. Like, they are living their lives, and they're doing just fine. And that felt radical to me, to write something like that. And so, yeah, the climate catastrophe part that just felt real as well. And it was sort of a device that allowed me to write the story that I wanted to write. Because I didn't have to think about the outside world and what they were doing, because I didn't really care. What I cared about was like what the folks on the reservation were doing and how they were living their lives.
And I guess as a follow-up question that you can tack on as you answer this question is just, if you can talk a little bit, Aya, and others afterwards, just how you think about decolonization as and its role in your work, and also in its role in advancing climate justice.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think, so one of the critical pieces for me around inclusion is just about, the way that the environmental movement has been racist and white. And, my kid at one point went to John Muir School, and John Muir is lauded as this environmentalist, but also there's like that shadow history of racism, with many of these environmental heroes and in the movement overall. And, sometimes in the past, people of color would be like victims, and it would be like white people talking about these victimized people of color to get other white people to either give money or become active. But there was always this sense that like people of color either were uninterested or maybe were victimized, right? And so part of what's critical for me is sort of decolonizing the legacy around how we think about and talk about the environment. Like, Indigenous people actually know what should be happening, and so Indigenous rights, that is climate justice. That whenever we get Indigenous people in, returning to Indigenous ways and Indigenous rights to the land, on the land, engaging with the land, gets us much more back into the kind of relationship that is sustainable. That's what you're talking about, like the generator, the getting the water, like that's not the carbon footprint of a corporation, right? So, Indigenous rights are climate justice. And Black people, like Black people, nowadays we think of Black people as an urban people, hip hop, boomboxes. Like, no, Black people came and were deeply engaged with the land, stewarding the land, And so those kinds of histories of relationship to land, to farming, to nature get erased, right? And then the story of nature is about white people, recreationally engaging with the land, right? That's what we understand, like the environment. She's a nature type. And so that, for me, that form of decolonization was also really, really important. And one of the things that's been critical for me, because I appreciate what you were saying, Sim, about finding your place in the climate movement. I started as a climate novelist, and it felt like, I'm writing whole novels about this. This is so important. But then it was like, well, actually, I need to be more grounded in movement. So I joined the Movement for Black Lives Climate Formation, and that's been really grounding me in Black people's relationship to the land. And so I think, that's a critical part of the story. The stories that I write are about women of African heritage discovering that they are already connected to issues of climate and deciding to become active. But the decolonial part is really that people of color, people in the global south, we are the ones who have been holding it down for the environment. And just to step into that legacy and to be bold and unapologetic about it, and then to have kind of a set of demands and a clear agenda for how climate justice is connected to all the other justices, and that we are the ones who need to step up even though we didn't cause the problem.
I have a really quick thing I want to ask. Who here lives in San Francisco? Okay, if you live in San Francisco, Monday, I want you to call the mayor's office. I want you to call your supervisor. The city of San Francisco is suing the EPA to try to gut clean water regulations. They are trying to strike down parts of the clean water law that we've lived with since the 70s. San Francisco wants to keep dumping sewage into the ocean, and they are teaming up with fossil fuel companies to go to the Supreme Court and ask them to put restrictions on what the EPA can do to keep our water clean. Please tell your elected officials in San Francisco to cut this out now. They need to bow out of that lawsuit immediately. They are providing cover for fossil fuel companies. I just had to say that really fast because my hair's been on fire the last couple of days since I read about this. I can't believe my city is doing that. I live in San Francisco. So just really quickly, I live in San Francisco. We are ground zero of tech solutionism. We are ground zero of AI garbage. It's not even AI, it's fake AI. It doesn't actually do any of the things that AI, science fiction has told us forever AI will do. And it is a huge environmental threat. And people in San Francisco, like the people around me, believe in this idea that we don't have to change anything. We can just come up with some whiz-bang technology that will fix our water, that will, fix our air, that will clean up the atmosphere somehow by magic. Whether they actually believe this or not, but every day I'm bombarded with this, and it makes me really angry. I'm going to just be honest. And being around that and seeing how that is connected to a very supremacist mindset in general, and like the kind of ideology that is coming out of the tech industry right now, it really scares me. And so this is radicalizing me. Living in San Francisco right now is radicalizing me. And I feel like it is all connected, and they are all one struggle for liberation. And if you live in San Francisco, you have to push back, but we have to push back everywhere. And so that is where it comes from for me, is being in San Francisco for 20 years now and seeing that ideology come in and start to kind of take over.
That seems like a perfect segue to you, Sim, actually.
So I live in a very different city, which is Houston, Houston, Texas. Very different vibe from San Francisco. And so I think going back to like why inclusion in this book. So this is a book about a protest occupation set in an alternate timeline where Al Gore won the 2000 election. And there's been like 20 years of the most pie-in-the-sky things the Democrats ever put on the table for climate change, like the Green New Deal to its fullest fruition, has come to pass, and yet all of this green infrastructure is being applied in neoliberal ways, so it's really only benefiting wealthy white communities, and leaving everyone else kind of to be scapegoats. And so it's a false solar punk utopia. And it's set in Houston, and I drew on so many of my experiences organizing with Occupy Houston back during the Occupy movement in 2011. And so there's all sorts of groups in this. I mean, you'll find there's, the main characters are a punk band, a queer punk band. But they end up at the center of this protest occupation, and there's, revcoms and the socialists and the anarchists are all arguing with each other, and there's, black racist neighborhood protection organizers, trying to stop construction for this green hyperway going out to the suburbs, and there's native justice groups, and there's, there's the Palestinian organizers and the Jews against apartheid, and like it's like this whole ecosystem. And something that happened, I tried to sort of, even though it's like sci-fi and it's alternate timeline, what happens in these protest occupations, if you're really, really not careful and purposeful, you will recreate all the systems of power that we see out in the world in microcosm within protest movement, and it tears it apart. And so that was one of the things that I was just really drawing on, like my experiences with that. And then I wrote it in 2021, having come off after like the whole city being very activated in 2020 during the movement for Black Lives, and going out to the protests every night, and like that was the biggest surge of organizing I've ever seen in the city of Houston. And then it was so brutally suppressed, I'm sure here as well as there, but in 2021 everyone's sort of like caught arrest charges, or they've got concussions, they're dealing with long-term health issues from inhaling tear gas, and sort of how do you recover from that? And so sort of like looking back on lessons learned from those protest occupations, it was sort of where I wrote from. And so the inclusivity is like, just because that is the nature of this organizing work, it has to be, and we have to be really purposeful about it. And also, show how the characters mess up and fail and are imperfect, and how do you keep going with the work even when you're imperfect and you fail. Yeah.
So I want to go back to this, the kind of tech false solutions aspect of this. And one of the things that I have seen in as a reader a lot is that, although for many of us our origin stories we're most familiar with are fundamentally about nature in some way, so much of what I read seems like, like tech is the thing that humanity is grappling with. Like so much of sci-fi feels that way to me. Like somehow tech is this like huge thing to overcome. Whereas I feel like, when I read like older writings and like origin stories, it's so much more about Mother Nature. And all of you in different ways kind of bring back this Mother Nature being incredibly powerful. Whether it's in this world or another world, or and I'm just curious, how you how you feel, if you feel like that's breaking from the way other writers are writing, if it's a different way of thinking, was that kind of natural to you? Because I do think as part of the climate crisis, one of the things that we struggle with is this tendency to lean towards these tech solutions and to not really respect the power of Mother Earth. And that ultimately, if we don't have food and water from Mother Earth, we don't, and some fiber for shelter, we don't have anything. And yet, so much of what I read in science fiction, it feels like something else is the threat. And I'm just curious how you all have thought about bringing that back.
Yeah, something that makes me frustrated is when I have a short story collection, and when I was working on getting those stories, just trying to place them with science fiction magazines, a lot of them are sort of solar punk, looking at green solutions, but not necessarily tech solutions. But, to me, science fiction should be inclusive of different agricultural technologies, like indigenous agricultural ways that are more sustainable. Science fiction to me could be different, technologies of interaction, of how we organize ourselves as a society. So but a lot of legacy science fiction magazines have as their, in their guidelines, there has to be a future tech for us to even consider your story, right? So I think that's part of the problem of why we're so programmed to look for those tech solutions, is because literally there are gatekeepers gatekeeping the stories we tell about the future and saying that, some new digital silicon chip-based technology has to be present for us to even tell stories about our futures. You know what I mean? So I think that like breaking that down and having more publishing spaces that are like, we are envisioning better, different, futures without needing that technology component, is like building those spaces is really important.
Yeah.
I was going to say, just piggybacking off of what you said, I think science fiction is still predominantly written by white men. And I think people write what they know, for better or worse, oftentimes for worse. And so if you have sort of the white male imagination, especially coming out of the last century, a lot of it is about domination and colonization. And, we're going into space and we're colonizing and we're dominating other species and, or aliens or whatever that is. And so that's the narrative that has dominated the genre. And really only in the past, I don't know, even maybe 10, 20 years have other voices risen up in the genre. It's still very, very difficult to get published if you're a woman of color in mainstream publishing, and especially in genre. Unless, you're writing romance or something, then that's okay. You can be in that category. But can you write hard science fiction? Absolutely not. That's very hard. And so I think that that's part of it too. It's a lack of imagination, it's a lack of vision, and it's who's dominating the stories that get told.
So I write contemporary realistic, and I'm definitely, my stories are all about how, these tech solutions are false solutions, and the real solution is people powered, right? It's our movements. Our movements are going to need to rise up and demand that we move sustainably to ensure our future. And the thing that I will say, for me that I'm chewing on that's a parallel is, in the same way that tech will be our salvation, the thing that I'm struggling with in the contemporary realistic is like the one exceptional person will be the solution, right? And I find myself really struggling to write the story that's about a mass movement rising up and winning, because it hasn't happened yet, right? So I have to imagine it based on what has happened with the movements. And, Keya, you and I as writers are sort of obsessed with the idea of a general strike. Like, what would it be like for the people to really rise up and be like, we're going to grind capitalism to a halt until you meet our demands, right? And I'm trying to wrap my head around that. And just like those tech solutions that we've been fed over and over again, like the idea, like, we don't have to re-indigenize. We don't have to move into any kind of harmonious relationship with the earth or look at the peoples who have done that and held those traditions. Silicon Valley is going to give us something, right? So that's the fantasy. And similarly, like, ordinary working class people don't need to do anything. We need to wait for the one exceptional person who's like a billionaire or a celebrity or, related to some royal family, and they're going to know, and they're going to be the one. So it's challenging because it's hard to write a book about 20 million people as main characters, right? But trying to figure out as an author how to write a book about where the story is that the collective is really making the big change. And I see those as really sort of similar. And it's challenging for me, even as an author who doesn't believe that in the world. I see that my storytelling has been colonized by those ideas.
Yeah, I'm just going to plug a couple things really quickly. On the podcast I co-host, Our Opinions Are Correct, we interviewed Wale Talabi, who wrote Shigidi and the Brass Head of Obalaphon. He's an incredible author. He's also an engineer, and he explained really clearly why carbon capture, this idea that we're going to take carbon out of the air and bury it, it's a pipe dream. Also, I did an article for my newsletter recently about like the idea of geoengineering, the idea that we can just shoot stuff into the atmosphere and it'll block sunlight and that'll solve. Again, total pipe dream, could actually do more harm than good. It could end up backfiring really horribly on us. Really quickly, your question about nature and like kind of depicting like our relationship with nature and the power of nature. I feel like for whatever reason, I've written some science fiction short stories where I kind of deal with that, but a lot of where I really get into that is in my fantasy work. and like All the Birds of the Sky has a lot about that, but also my fantasy novel that comes out next year is kind of all about that on some level. It's about like how if we don't respect the power of nature, nature will make us respect it, kind of, and about how there is a power in meeting nature where it is and in kind of coming to grips with it. So I think I think fantasy is actually a really good way of thinking about that sometimes, because fantasy often is about going into natural spaces and kind of, meeting some presence there.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to some audience questions. There is a microphone up here if folks want to come up and ask questions. We've got a few minutes for that. So come around and write to this mic if you have a question. I'm really struck by, both of you are kind of talking about, like, some stories are easier to tell in fantasy, maybe about nature. We must tell some stories in contemporary, realistic ways, or else how are people going to know how to plug into movements if we don't? And also, there are some things that are just more fiction right now, like a general strike. Like, there's nothing real about that at this point, and so we can only explore it in fiction. And so I'm just struck by that that different genres have these different roles, And Aya, you mentioned how like dystopia has done its job at this point. We get it. Things could get really bad. What do you all see, while we wait for questions, what do you all see as like, and you started to answer this, Charlie Jane, of just like, what are the types of writing that are a tool for getting people into action on climate change, and what types of writing do you think are best suited to what types of activation, if that makes sense? Yeah.
I'm going to say what types of writing I think are not a good tool for thinking about climate change. I think apocalypses. I am so sick of post-apocalyptic storytelling. I'm sick of it. I mean, I've written some too. We've all done it. But I feel like I just don't need any more apocalypses.
I have to chime in on that. I really appreciate it, because the thing about apocalyptic storytelling is basically the story starts out presupposing that we will fail now, right? Like all the stories that are like about, the terrible disaster comes, presumes that we won't take action, and I was like, it's as if the Obama, slogan was no, we can't, right? And so I feel like it's really important to find different interesting ways of talking about the future. There are many, but yeah, it's time for us to think about what we can do.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little contrary. I do agree, but I think for Native Americans, we are living in our apocalypse.
Yeah.
We have gone through it, and we have somehow survived. So I think we can look to Indigenous ways, Indigenous thought, Indigenous life ways, for ways to get through what's coming next.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we can ignore the apocalypse that those of us who are native to this land have already suffered under colonization.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's still utility to all genres, but I think some false solutions actually bother me the most. So like, I get frustrated when there's like solar punk or like utopian books, and I fight it in my own writing too. But like, some of them still repeat carceral mindset. There's like punish. Like, how do we get to the utopia? Because we have like vigilantes going around killing anyone who, uses too much carbon. Like, ooh, I don't think that's going to work out the way you think it is. Like, I don't think that's it. Also, my spouse works for NASA, and he works for the, on spacewalks and stuff. And so I'm a Star Trek kid. I'm a total Trekkie, but I think we need to let go a little bit of how much we think that, we're a hop, skip, and a jump away from living on Mars, because that's just so unrealistic. And so the idea that like billionaires are going to be able to escape to space, like absolutely no one's escaping to space. Yeah. This is the only planet that we have. Yes. It's not comfortable up there. It's not
No. Earth is awesome.
There's like a 40-step procedure to taking a poop on the ISS. So it's like a very involved, there's a lot of training that goes into it. It's a vacuum tube. Sometimes everything doesn't get in the tube. So like, You know, it's not pleasant. So they're welcome to go up there and try, but like, yeah, that's not a real solution.
Yeah. All right, so we've got a couple people in line. Let's just ask both questions, and then I'm going to let the panel respond to both.
My favorite authors to do a little wordplay on the fly. So I know there are a lot of slogans and set phrases that have like real policy demands, like free Palestine, right? And or defund the police, and things that are maybe more designed to alarm people to spring them into action. The TikTokers, like their flowers are blooming in Antarctica. And I'm wondering if, thinking back on your own work, maybe something one of your characters have said, or maybe things that come to mind for you when you're writing, like what are the sort of things you want us to be keeping in mind that will either be about concrete policy demands or to like have in front of our mind to make us want to take action?
Hello. Thank you for the great panel so far. I wanted to ask, because we're talking a lot about climate justice and kind of the greater decolonial project. You've all spoken a lot about how that shows up in the content of your writing. I was curious if you could speak more about how that shows up in the process, from constructing ideas to drafting to editing, critiquing, collaborating, all of those pieces.
Yeah, I think just get all the questions.
All of them?
Thank you. I unfortunately came late to the panel and was just hearing you talk, and I write about climate change myself. I wrote a book for Duke University Press on climate change and critical polar aesthetics, working with artists and filmmakers. Anyway, I did not know about that you're under pressure in the science fiction genre to publish this techno stuff. That was fascinating, and it's really interesting to hear about fantasy being a more open genre in which to write, and it's making me think, because I write about contemporary art, how that works in relationship to contemporary art as well. All the limits of how your work gets out, how it doesn't even get written if you can't publish, and all these crazy things you have to think about. I guess, one of the things there's been a lot of events at UC Berkeley this year on the climate crisis, finally, especially in literature writing, and it's starting to open up. But, there tends to be a focus on hope and alternative futures and all these things, which is really important, and an anxiousness about, as you said, the apocalypse and the difficulties that we're facing, and how to work this through without it feeling, romanticized or nostalgic or whatever. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, because it is extremely difficult. How to balance all this, think through things, deal with indigenous perspectives, Black perspectives, etc. Okay, sorry. Okay, that's it. Yeah, respond.
Okay, so
if we don't, yeah. Okay.
thanks very much for all of you coming. It's been great. One of the things that I think about and I'm active with is transportation, because so many greenhouse gases come from transportation. We've got to figure out a way to move ourselves around and our goods differently. So, but it's not very exciting. I mean, I'm a public transit advocate. And have any of you ever thought of centering stories around how fun and exciting public transit is?
I love it. And the plaid will be the last question. Okay.
So I heard mentioned during this panel of like Band-Aid tech solutions versus like trying, the raw power of Mother Nature. And my question was, like, as a species, intentionally or not, we have demonstrated that we can affect like really large systems on the planet, Mother Nature, so to speak, for better or for worse. And we also I completely agree with you that tech cannot be the full solution. We cannot ignore the problems. But at the same time, I was wondering, knowing that we can affect these systems intentionally, is there some maybe how do we grapple with the fact that we can and whether we should, I guess, is my question. Versus just pulling back and kind of completely going back to living with nature.
Hi. I'm a second-year law student, and so this is kind of directed towards Rebecca, but towards all of you, is that I sort of see solutions in a legal context, and so I wonder if, you say apocalypse is a not very inspired way to see future issues and problem solving, but could stories that follow legal cases or legal movements, like that's where I see a lot of power, is in winning legal cases, getting legislation passed. That's not a sexy novel idea if I were to write it, because I'm not an author, but you are. And so I wonder if there's room there to take something so powerful as a mechanism and to turn it into something compelling.
Thank you. So I heard two pitches from our questions. One is please write a book about public transit, and the other is please write a book about the legal system working despite the fact that our Supreme Court has been co-opted by a bunch of ethno-white nationalists who are breaking the law all the time. But it's going to be a great book. It's going to be a great book. And then we had, can you come up with a slogan on the fly or one from your books? We have the process and, decolonizing and inclusion within your process. And we have how do we acknowledge that we can change the system in our writing and what's the balance there? So I'm gonna go down the line. Everyone's got a couple minutes. These are also gonna be your last words, just so we have time to buy books, everybody, and we'll wrap it up from there.
And I just have to say, I'm so excited to go to the electoral panel next. So I'm going to be jetting out just at 12:25 and running to the Freight and Salvage because I don't want to miss a word of that. So I won't be signing now, but if anybody wants me to sign anything, I'll be back later after the climate poetry reading, which I'm also in. Anyway, so there are two that I want to respond to, the legal novel and the slogans. So one of the slogans that's been really important for me is the 3.5%. So this, anytime there's been a movement that has a nonviolent movement that has deeply engaged 3.5% of the population, historically it has always won, right? So, we don't actually need everyone to agree with us. We just need 3.5% of the population to deeply engage and then, for it to ripple out from there for the climate movement to succeed. So I think it's important not to focus on that one person who really disagrees with you and pour tons and tons and tons of energy into that and get stuck there, that we actually have to figure out how to organize with folks who are close, right? And actually, we also can't get caught up in well, you and I disagree on 1% of what we believe in, so let's argue about that the whole time, right? We have to be effective in building movements and building coalitions. And that 3.5% stat comes from the very radical fringe outlet, the BBC. So, so that's my slogan. And the thing that I want to say about the legal, so at one point, someone can ask me the story later. At one point, I seemed like I was going to be in position to start a publishing imprint. And and that legal story could totally work, especially as a romance. And one of the things that, I write heist and spy and drama, and I also write romance and sometimes sexy erotic romance and sometimes YA but all those things. And romance is really great because so often the politics of romance are awful. It's oh, everybody wants the Duke. Oh, if only the Duke liked me, whatever. That it doesn't have to be like that. Romance is fun and juicy and sexy and can be totally radical as well. So ooh, a legal procedural. We have a little bit of John Grisham shadiness, and then we could have a romance and and those were the kinds of books that I really wanted to read for ordinary people, particularly women who are reading in this genre that's just been completely left for dead politically, right? There's the assumption that nothing is happening politically there that's of interest, and it really can be a radicalizing tool. So I think I'm really excited about all the possibilities for climate fiction in the popular genres, because there's brilliant and beautiful literary climate fiction, but we know literary fiction is read by a very, very small number of people, and the climate movement, in order to win, needs a lot of people. So I think that there are lots of possibilities there. Sadly, I will not be the one to write that book, but someone will and can.
So this is so totally random, but I was just thinking of this. So I was talking to Stacey Abrams, and she's one of my heroes, so that was very exciting. And she said, she's a romance writer as well. And she said that she wanted to write these thrillers because she's a lawyer, that's her background, but no one would publish a black woman writing these sort of political thrillers. They just didn't believe that she could muster that up. So she's like, okay, it's a romance. And so she couched it in romance, and that's how she got it published. And now she can write whatever she wants. But but I just thought that was so cool. So definitely you can write your legal thriller. I put a lot of law into my books, sort of subtly, but certainly the character of the law in Indian country is a big deal because it's so bizarre and so convoluted. And you can be on Indian land here and then be on state land here and then be on federal land here. And so that affects everything that's going on, the policy that attaches to that land and the way that the people move through it. So you can do stuff like that, and then you can still write a great fantasy adventure with gods and heroes and monsters and all that good stuff. That's all I have.
I actually have a story about public transportation. Sorry, yeah. It's the last story in my collection. Real Sugar is hard to find, and it's imagining Houston, where I'm from, which is such a car-centric city. Can we imagine, a totally pie-in-the-sky solar punk? This was let me just imagine the world I want, where they're tearing up all the roads. We no longer need roads as a society, and how do we have disability justice still and access and emergency response systems and everything? But it's this joyous project of we are tearing up all the asphalt, we are healing the land. There's still paths, and there's trains and there's all these green solutions. But that was really joyful and delightful to write, just to free myself of any sort of practical considerations and can I imagine this really beautiful world. So I don't think that book's for sale here, but it's called Real Sugar is Hard to Find.
It's
amazing. For my slogan, I am going to take kind of one of the closing images of this book, a little bit of spoiler alert, but it's Be the Mycorrhiza. So there's sort of a analogy in the book, and I'm not the first person to say this about protest movements. I've heard this other places as well, but the idea that a protest occupation or the big marches, the shutdowns, those are the fruiting body of the mushroom is the mushroom, right? Which you see mushrooms come up out of the earth, and all of a sudden one morning you might look out in your yard and there's hundreds of mushrooms all of a sudden. Where did these come from? So that's sort of the protest occupation. They can only come up out of the earth when the conditions are right? But in the meantime, the vast majority of the fungus is the mycorrhiza, which are these threads of connection underneath the soil, which can spread for miles and miles throughout the forest, right? And every time there's a fruiting body that comes up, they spread, millions and millions of spores everywhere, and you don't know where it goes. And the mushrooms are there in a flash, and then they die in a day. But they've spread these spores, and then sometimes for months or for years, this mycorrhiza is invisibly spreading, underground. And so especially in a place like Texas, where so much of the work that we do as social justice activists has to be underground, we don't have there's no legal, sometimes, but the courts are hostile, the state legislature is hostile. It's so hard to get anything done. Sometimes when I've worked on big legislative campaigns, we almost got an equal rights amendment passed in the city of Houston, and then the state government made it illegal for any cities to have an equal rights amendment, and so then the cities that did have equal rights amendments lost them. So it's almost if you fight for something too openly, you can make things worse for your cause. You have to be very strategic. So being the mycorrhiza, even when a big protest movement sort of fails and it's depressing and it gets crushed by the police or whatever, the student occupations we just saw, you don't know how many millions of spores that those incredible students spread in the social consciousness of the world that are taking root right now, that are spreading mycorrhiza. Whole new networks of activation have happened because of what those student protests did. So they didn't fail, they weren't crushed. They set the conditions for whatever's coming next. Yeah. And all we have to do is keep in the interim spreading the mycorrhiza. The next time the fruiting bodies appear, it's going to be bigger and bigger and bigger every time until we win. So,
Woo!
Yeah, I mean, to the question about process and kind of writing process, and, I wrote a thing about this a while ago. I really feel like when you are imagining the future, when you are thinking about like a possible future, when you're trying to conjure that image of like what the future might look like, you have to factor in climate change, and you have to think about like the kinds of movements and the kinds of communities that are going to happen in response to that. And you have to think about it like with creativity and with compassion. You have to actually like imagine people surviving and building something that's more that is going to serve the whole community. But you have to you can't kind of think of that as an afterthought. You have to kind of, the moment you're thinking about like actually the present as well at this point, but especially the near future, you have to that has to be one of the first things that you think about. And it makes me frustrated when I see a book that's set like 10, 20 years in the future and the author either didn't give any thought to climate and how we're going to deal with it, or it's very clear that they did that as an afterthought. In terms of public transit, actually I'm going to plug a book that my partner wrote, Annalie Newitz. They're on a panel later today. They wrote a novel called The Terraformers that has a lot about public transit, and it is a lot about public transit as a tool of liberation and of making a better world. And it has a flying train that is like sentient, that falls in love with a cat who's an investigative journalist. It's very sweet, and highly recommend that. I'm sure you could get that around here somewhere. Yeah, anyway, so I've got stickers. Come find me. Thanks.
All right, huge thanks to our panel of amazing authors. Huge thanks to our audience for coming out, and thank you in advance for going over and buying books. Really huge thanks also to the Bay Area Book Festival and all the sponsors. Thank you all so, so much.
Thank you. Are you around?
Yeah.
Are you going to the election?
Yeah, I'll walk over.
I'm running over there.